By now your fabric should be out of the washer and dryer where you washed and dried it on hot because that shrinks it the most. And then you pressed it and now you're ready to begin your project. If you have fat quarters, you just need to press them and fold them back up. I'll get to that in a little bit. But I also said you could buy yardage. If you have yardage, you'll want to fold it up selvage to selvage. And the selvage edge, you can tell, is a little different from the other ends. So this is a selvage right here, and anything that's not a selvage is called a cut edge, and you can usually tell the selvage you can't pull anything out of, but the cut edge you can usually unravel a little bit. The two selvages should be parallel to each other, and the cut edges are perpendicular to that. You are going to fold your fabric in half, selvage to selvage. And then we're going to make 4 cuts for this project. We need 2 strips that are 2 inches by width of fabric, and we need 2 rectangles that are 8 by 7.5 inches each. If your cut edge is really nice and perpendicular to your selvage edge, which I'll show you what that looks like over here. So I can tell this is pretty square. Another way I could tell is if I pull a thread, it's gonna pull the whole way through. You're good to go. So you can measure from here 2 inches down and cut. But sometimes you'll get something like this where the cut edge is not straight. It's kind of skewed. I find that if you buy your fabric from a quilting store, you're gonna have the best chance of your edges being perpendicular, a nice clean edge. That's because quilters are mad, crazy, awesome at cutting fabric, and usually it's quilters who work at quilting shops. If you go to a dedicated fabric shop like Joann's, you'll have a good chance of it being cut right as well. If you go to a place like Walmart and buy fabric from there, it's really dependent on the associate you get to cut your fabric. I've had to cut my own fabric at Walmart sometimes, so that's where you're more likely to get something that's skewed or off. That's okay, we just have to find the fabric grain. And how you do that is you take a piece of scissors.
And this is important to pay attention to so you can make sure that your measurements are correct.
Turn out right, yes.
And that you don't have weird extra fabric or weird missing
or weird
fabric.
angles. So when we're cutting these rectangles, fabric is made up of threads that are going this direction and this direction. You want your rectangles to basically be in line with those threads. When they're off, it skews. A good example of this is if you've ever had a pant leg that while you were wearing it, like just kind of crept like towards the front or towards the back. That is an example of when you haven't cut the fabric on grade. Like you can press it and initially it looks right, but as you're wearing it, it kind of creeps around. So to straighten out your fabric grain or to find the grain, you are gonna cut a slit through one edge of the selvage that is perpendicular to the selvage. You also want to go at least a 1/2 inch in because if you go less than that, you're just gonna pull threads. So we're gonna make a nice healthy cut a 1/2 inch from the edge. And then because this is woven fabric, watch, you're gonna tear. And now your fabric is on grain again.
Meaning straight.
Yes. Okay.
Essentially.
So I'm gonna show you 3 ways to cut the ties. The first is if you buy a jelly roll. A jelly roll kind of looks like a cinnamon bun made of fabric in the store. And what the jelly roll is it's a bunch of strips that are width of fabric, but 2.5 inches wide. Why 2.5 inches? Not sure, except that's a standard quilting measurement, so they're always 2.5 by the width of fabric. But we want strips that are 2 inches by the width of fabric. So if you have a jelly roll, you're gonna take one of your strips out and you're going to cut a 1/2 inch off. So in here, I'm lining up this 1/2 inch with the edge of the fabric. Actually, I need to press this a little bit. And so I'm gonna go ahead and cut a 1/2 inch off. And then my strip is now 2 inches by width of fabric. So do this 2 times if you have a jelly roll. Oh.
Why 2 times if you have you mean with
You need two
different pieces?
Yes, you
okay.
need 2 pieces of this.
2 of the little rolled up things.
Yep.
Okay.
Say you have fabric instead. You can lay this down and you can simply go 2 inches from the top, but I told you that a rotary mat cutter and all that stuff was optional. I love it. If you teach sewing at all, like they're indispensable in the classroom, it just makes things so much easier once you get used to them, but you might not have that. So you might just have a tape measure or ruler. If that's the case, you're gonna come out here and you are going to measure 2 inches from the top and make a little mark. Now I have a pen that the ink disappears after a while. That's fine, you might not have that. A good substitute is a washable marker. Actually, my pen is not showing up right now. I'll trade it up from chalk. I have some chalk. So you are gonna measure down 2 inches from the edge. Every once in a while, make a little mark. And every once in a while, about every 4 to 6 inches, I'd say.
Could you do the ripping trick again, or is that a bad idea?
You could. Sometimes it gets a little bubbly and wavy. You could do the ripping again, but for this time, I'm just gonna mark it and then cut it.
You get a more consistent cut by
yes, you get a more consistent
cutting.
Cut. So I'm gonna find a straight edge that connects all these marks that I made, and I'm gonna mark it again. And then I'll simply come back with shears, which are fabric cutting scissors, and cut it. The reason you want shears or dedicated fabric cutting scissors is that paper is actually thicker than fabric. And so if you cut multiple things with your shears, you won't be able to get nice, clean cuts on the fabric.
Don't cut paper with your shears.
That's true.
Or you'll get in trouble.
Yeah.
With your wife.
That's true.
Or the person who owns the shears.
Yep. Also true for hair cutting shears as well. So you would repeat this 2 times and you'd have 2 2-inch strips by width of fabric. The last thing I'm going to show you is how to cut those out of a fat quarter, because you are supposed to have a fat quarter bundle. And if that's all you bought, that's fine. So a fat quarter, I'm going to explain what that is. When you buy fabric off the bolts and you take it up to the counter at Joann's, you go, I want so much of a yard. A yard is 3 feet or 36 inches in this direction. So if you want 1/4 of a yard, they're going to measure 9 inches down and cut a straight line here. So you will have a 9-inch strip that is width of fabric. A fat quarter, they actually take that whole yard, they open it up, and they cut it into 4ths like this. So that's why it's called a fat quarter. It's no longer width of fabric, but it is a quarter. So to show you the comparison right here, I've laid out a yard of fabric. This is a 1/4 yard of fabric, so 9 inches by width of fabric. This is a fat quarter. So these wind up being about 18 inches high by 22 inches wide. Both ways you get 4 out of a yard, but that's the difference between them.
What's the point of the fat quarter?
I think it was invented for quilting. It's a nice way to get a little stash of fabric. Usually they're coordinated. I like them because they are cut before they ever go to the store, so you're not going to have usually that grain line problem that I talked about earlier. But as you notice, we don't have width of fabric here, so we're going to have to make this work. So how we do this is we take our fat quarter, and we're going to identify which one is the longer direction. You can eyeball it. I can tell this is the longer direction, but if you're bad at eyeballing it, just take 1/4 and fold. And like when you were in, elementary, there should be one that's longer than the other. and making snowflakes. So you want to cut parallel to the long edge 2-inch strips, and we're going to cut 4 of these instead of 2. I'm actually, see how raveled this edge is? I'm actually going to cut a little bit more than 2 inches and go back and cut that ravelly edge off. One.
And this is where the mat and the board and the rotary cutter would really come in handy, because measuring and marking all of these would take a lot of time.
Yes, that's true. Although if you make a good job on your first one, you can lay it out.
You could use it as a
just trace.
template. Yeah.
3. Oh, so sometimes this happens. You don't want to go back and saw. If you have to recut, you want to not move the ruler, but you can take your shears and simply cut it apart. Get this laying nice and flat again. And then so these are going to form our ties. So what you do to make this with the fabric is you go back and you match. So we only have selvages on one end. I put those together, but go to the other short ends, put them together, and you're going to sew parallel to this edge. I just put it at the edge of my presser foot. Aha! My thread came out of my needle. If you don't have a long enough tail when you're beginning, sometimes your thread will come out of your needle. It's good to see all these things happen to me, right? That way you know when it happens to you, it still happens to all of us.
Sewing is an adventure. This is now becoming a how to thread this machine video too.
Yes, I did film one of those though. The reason I unthreaded it is I noticed that my presser foot wasn't up, and when your presser foot isn't up, you might not get the thread inside the tension discs. And then you get the little snarls of fabric. Okay, so you're gonna sew here at the edge of your presser foot. And do that for both strips. No, that's my sewn one already.
And since it was a quarter, it was half the length of fabric length. So now you're just putting the two halves back together.
Yep, correct. So then the last thing we need to cut, we have 2 strips for ties, and the last thing we need to cut is 2 rectangles that are 8 inches by 7.5 inches wide. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to measure down 8 inches. And do that on the other side of the fabric too. Then I'm gonna cut 1 8-inch strip. And I'm going to fold this in half and cut 7.5 inches in this way. So
this all makes so much sense, but it's things that I wouldn't think to do.
you can also, I'm showing you that you can get all the pieces for the mask out of one fat quarter, but you can cut these pieces out of different fabrics. In fact, a lot of people say that it's better to have the inside of your mask be a different color so that people know the outside from the inside. But that's how you cut your pieces. So 2 pieces that are 2 inches high by width of fabric, 2 pieces that are 8 inches high by 7.5 inches wide.